You might have seen people displaying all kinds of fan merchandise for their favorite idols, artists, or characters. And this type of fandom, oshikatsu in Japanese, has grown into a significant economic driver since the pandemic, and corporate Japan is paying close attention to it. Companies recognize oshikatsu as a potential way to boost sluggish consumption in Japan, and as a spending habit that is relatively resilient to inflation. Oshikatsu accounts only for 2% of the total annual retail sales in Japan, but its economic impact goes much further than direct oshikatsu spendings, and this is driven by the strong personal value oshikatsu provides. And as a result, people continue spending on related activities even during economic downturns. So, who are these people who are involved in oshikatsu? What motivates them to spend significant amount of time and money on this activity? And could this be a template for other countries? I'm going to explore all these questions with Dr. Fabio Gygi from the University of London and leading specialist about Japanese society. Dr. Fabio Gygi, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's kick off the podcast with the first question. And that is, of course, what is oshikatsu? Can you explain oshikatsu and what its role is in Japanese society?
I think oshikatsu is best described as a form of fandom in which fans engage to support their favorite oshi. So that means a person or a character or a group or sometimes a product that they strongly admire, that they want to push. So the term is rooted in Japanese fandom culture, but increasingly also resonates beyond Japan's borders. And it is commonly associated with idols, with celebrities, but it can also be associated with anime characters or even sports teams. So it's similar to fandom in that fans have a desire to be closer to their idols. And the Japanese word is made up from oshi, so the person you want to push or promote, and katsu, which means activities. And so it's a neologism, a newly coined word that follows a long line of other neologisms like konkatsu, like marriage activities, which means the concerted effort to find a suitable partner for marriage, or shukatsu, ending activities, the active preparation for one's own death. So the term itself only appears sort of in 2016 and becomes more widespread on Twitter as a hashtag around 2018. And in 2021, it was nominated as a candidate for Word of the Year, which means it has become mainstream by that point.
You already dropped the word fandom, and I was wondering, how does oshikatsu differ from other forms of fandom, especially that you see in countries outside of Japan?
I think that's a very good question, and I'm not sure whether I have such an answer that is really based in the empirical work, because most of my work has been on Japan. But I think there's two important aspects that distinguish oshikatsu from fandom. And one is that it is more of a focus on individual practice rather than on membership in a particular community. And the other aspect is there is a desire for a different kind of intimacy than in fandom. But if you compare it to the big sort of international fandoms like, Beyonce or Taylor Swift, you of course see a lot of similarities as well. So the difference in Japan is probably that it is, like most things, better organized, or rather it's given more structure through particular kinds of social interactions, like you have in fandom, like fan clubs and so on and so forth, that often organize activities, but also police, the accepted forms of expressing your admiration for your idol, and, sort of stop their own fans from becoming stalkers, for example. And this is less pronounced in oshikatsu. I would say.
What I find remarkable about Oshikatsu is that it covers so many demographics. It's not only younger demographics, but you also see it even with older demographics. How do you explain its broad appeal?
I think part of it is meaning making. It is a way to create something really meaningful out of a hobby. So I would put it into that particular kind of bracket. And it requires a certain amount of economic power, of economic resources. So you have to have income on the side, let's say, to put into these activities, because often they're the things that you buy and the activities that you participate in, they come at a price. So you could say it's easier even to engage with for older generations. But there's an aspect of nurturing your idol that I think is attractive to middle-aged and older people as well. You know, once your own children, if you had them leave the house, and you sort of you look for something to do or some kind of activity that makes life meaningful and exciting. Oshikatsu is a popular way of doing that.
I was wondering what enabled Oshikatsu. So, Oshikatsu has evolved in Japan from a niche subculture into a mainstream phenomenon. But what social, economic, or cultural factors enabled it to emerge and thrive?
I think they're both historical and social factors. And among the social factors, I would count that fandom and fan cultures and merchandise have been a part of the Japanese experience for a very long time. Sort of in early modern Japan, you have fan clubs for famous kabuki actors, for example. They already create merchandises, Ichimatsu Ningyo, for example, which are now famous as Japanese dolls all across the world. They were originally a kind of merchandise for the actor Sanno Ichimatsu. And so there are sort of I think there's historical precedents to that, but of course all of this takes off in a quite different way post-war, with mass culture, with a lot of American influence in terms of rock and pop music, and there are also social factors, I would say, that a sense of alienation, a sense of, you know, that the traditional community that you may be part of does not really allow you to express yourself in a kind of individual kind of way, and that this is something that fandom allows you to do. You can express yourself or your admiration for somebody, or channel this energy rather in that direction, and that leads to a sense of belonging, a sense of connection, and sometimes to a sense of community as well.
Talking about fandom, in Japan for a long time it was very much centered around solo idols and small groups. But it all changed in 2005 with the all-female group AKB48. What role did they play in revolutionizing fandom, and Oshikatsu in particular?
Well, in the world of Oshikatsu, there is a distinction being made between the Hako Oshi and the other Oshis, right? Hako Oshi means the box. You essentially take a whole group. You're a fan of a group, and you take the group as it is. What changed with AKB48, and what is its genius in a way, is that you become the fan of one person within the group. And the group itself is set up in a way that allows for direct competition between the individual members of the group. So this is it's a different kind of fandom, and it's something that has been you could say it's a commercialization of fandom. So you don't no longer have people who are fans of the whole group, but you have a particular person you want to push, and the way to push them to do the oshikatsu is to go to their events, go to their handshaking meetings, buy the product, obviously, and also express your fandom to the outside world. So there is a different kind of dynamic that comes in, which is both, you could say it's a kind of development, capitalistic development of fandom. So Yasushi Akimoto, who's the producer of AKB48, is really a genius in realizing that there is quite a lot of potential in spreading out the fandom, making the members of the groups compete with each other for the top spots. And of course, those who are most successful, then they will front the next single, for example. And as you can see from M48, it's an enormous amount of people, right? And the other aspect of that is, of course, that you can have the same group perform in different places at the same time in different formations. So it's a much more flexible division of labor.
Fabio, can you explain how an individual progresses from initial interest to lifelong dedication? And I was wondering, is this journey primarily individual, or does it also happen in some sort of a group? And does that play a role, actually, the group, or is it very much focused towards the individual?
I think in traditional fandom, the community plays the most important role, rather than the individual person and their desires, because you may go to a concert and you meet other people and you develop deep and long-lasting friendships with these people that can last over a lifetime. And so you grow old with the particular person or band, let's say, that you're a fan of. And so these ties are they are usually very long lasting, and you buy the merchandise, and in a way the Alfie, for example, the Japanese rock band, the Alfie, is a good example of that, because they're still around. They can last 30, 40, maybe 50 years, and so you grow older with them, and so they accompany you across the life course. Now this is slightly different in oshikatsu, I think, because what fans look for in oshikatsu is more of an intimate one-to-one connection with their idol. And so that makes it a bit more difficult. So I would say that the dynamic sort of goes in the other direction. You want to get closer. And in order to do that, you have to buy the merchandise, you have to buy the time of the oshi. If you manage to go to these one-on-one meetings, for example. And that's why many people actually support oshis that are not very established yet, right? Because then you have a sense of you're really helping them to make it, and you can sort of participate in their success vicariously. So the dynamic is slightly different, and I think there is more of an in the attempt of getting closer to the oshi, that's also where fandom can sort of break down. Sort of in the traditional, very well organized fandoms, it's very clear the artists or the person you're a fan of, they live in a separate world. It's often called the Genokai, right? The world of talents and idols. And that is sort of, it overlaps with the everyday world. But the overlap is very strictly controlled. And often when a scandal emerges, it is because the boundary has been broken between the Genokai, the world of the talents, and the world of the everyday people. And so the fans, they want to get closer, yes, but they do respect normally. And that's also very important, because you can't really fantasize about somebody, if you know them really too well already. So there needs to be some kind of mystery, some kinds of distance there to keep the fandom going.
You wrote in an article on the online platform The Conversation, you wrote there that, and let me quote, people engaging in oshikatsu make clear that fan activities address a deep wish for connection, validation, and belonging. And I was wondering, what does this suggest about the psychological needs of a fan who forms a relationship with an oshi?
I think there is that, I mean, these desires really speak to the sort of the idea that Japan has become a muen shakai, a society without ties, where social links are increasingly fraying. Um, and actually, I think that's how it's portrayed, sort of in the mainstream literature. I don't actually think that that is necessarily always the case, but I think what happens is that the social relations that you have through work, through your neighborhood, if you have a family, through the children and the children that socialize with each other, are considered to be sort of established and given, that they're not a means, they're just there, right? And they put a lot of obligations on you. They're not a place where you can express yourself freely. You have to be very mindful about what the neighbors think, about what your colleagues think at work, and so on and so forth. So I think the attraction of fandom is that there is another kind of world. It means participating in this world that is slightly different from the everyday, where it is about you. It is about what you like. And it is about being recognized as a fan of a particular person by other members in that community, for example. So I think it speaks to this idea of individualized desire rather than a general social sphere or social link.
I want to talk with you about the downsides of oshikatsu. At what point does oshikatsu cease to be a hobby and starts to resemble a behavioral addiction comparable to gambling or even alcohol or drug abuse?
That's a very good and very delicate issue because, of course, as an anthropologist, I do participant observation, I interview people, and we normally we sort of try to avoid pathologizing things. So rather than to say, oh, or assume that, there's something pathological at work, we sort of try to understand how meaning is made out of these different activities. But I must say that in my own experience, I've come across a few cases where there is, I thought the person was struggling a lot, borrowing money, for example, to continue to support an oshi that this particular person had supported for a very long time. Um, and it had a very negative impact. It led to lots of conflict within the family. This person was married with children, with adult children, and it was also the family didn't really understand why this was so important to them. So there it can lead to a kind of it can lead to all kinds of issues, and I would say it can become an addiction if that's your only outlet that you have in a way for your what you want to tell the world about yourself. Then that may become a problem down the road. But it is not an automatic thing. It really depends on your own situation.
And some people, they build their identity and daily motivation almost entirely around their oshi. What psychological or social fallout do you observe when the Oshi faces something like a scandal, graduates from the group, or even announces a relationship?
Oh God, yes. That's See, this is very interesting because on one hand, yes, you want to keep things very stable, and this is true of the traditional fandom, like let's say for rock or pop bands, right? You expect them to go on and on and on and on. Nobody expects them to stop making music or to disband, God forbid. Um, but in Oshikatsu, there is a more dynamic phenomenon because people who want to support their oshi, they want them to succeed, so they want them to move up in the world, or rather they want something to happen. So the scandal can often lead to an enormous amount of new information and new fan activity, so it isn't always a negative kind of thing. um, Graduating from a group, on the other hand, is really, it's a very big issue, right? It threatens to disrupt the fandom. Announcing a relationship is also very difficult, and most people who work for the talent agencies, actually both men and women and women are usually, the rule is that they can't have relationships, and they definitely cannot be open about them, because the idea is that they need to be available for fantasy, so people can fantasize, oh, what would it be like if she was my girlfriend or my boyfriend. um, so announcing a relationship means that you essentially remove yourself as an object of fantasy. And if you depend as an Oshi, for example, on that kind of income, it also, can cut into your bottom line considerably. Um, it is, I think, this is interesting. But if you read Usami Rin's novel Idol Burning, um, the use this, which is about a young woman who essentially lives vicariously through her oshi, and there is a scandal at the very beginning that sort of triggers the plot of the novel, and it's handled very well. You sort of get a sense of how what happens, but it's also the moment where you realize how interesting it is and how it creates gossip and rumors and attempts at interpretation, and the whole online sphere sort of blows up around that, and it also drives fandom and oshikatsu in a very important way. So the scandal is not always negative. It can also have a sort of it's a way to be becoming known to a larger audience as well.
Looking at Oshikatsu as a cultural ambassador, could Oshikatsu be considered a form of soft power for Japan? And where might it strengthen Japan's global image, and where could it reinforce common stereotypes?
As a form of soft power, it already has a very strong function, and it goes both ways, right? So there's lots of, let's say, East Asian or Southeast Asian fans of Japanese idols who come to Japan to participate in oshikatsu and who organize their own fan activities in their own countries. But it's also many Japanese fans who are K-pop, have an oshi in a K-pop group, and therefore, travel to Korea and learn Korean. So it has helped to create much more interest in international travel and also learning of languages, which was something that was always, over the last few years, Japanese exchange students numbers, for example, have dwindled quite precariously. But we can see oshikatsu as a kind of revival of these international connections. And in that sense, it's definitely a form of soft power. It is also something that the government increasingly is relying on. There is the hope that Oshikatsu, as a business model, can sort of help to shift some of the wealth of the older generation to the more struggling younger generation. So it is recognized as a sort of both a social and an economic phenomenon. And very interestingly, if you look at the psychological literature that comes out of Japan at the moment, journal articles mostly, it's Oshikatsu is most often framed in terms of well-being, which I think is quite interesting. So it's not, if you think about the earlier otaku culture, which was sort of dominant, male dominated, and was usually seen as sort of pathological, and had a long way to be recognized, both in Japan and internationally. Oshikatsu is very different because of the economic aspect. It's something that is actively promoted, you could say. So that definitely would strengthen Japan's global image. But of course, yes, these two things, the also reinforcing of stereotypes always go hand in hand, really. Of course, the idea of the fan that goes absolutely crazy and spends all their money and goes into debt to support Deroshi is probably not a very positive image. Yes.
And in your opinion, does Japanese fandom like Oshikatsu have a lasting future, or should we see it as a passing trend?
Yes, that's a difficult one to answer because trends in Japan are extremely short-lived on one hand. On the other hand, there's aspects of Japanese popular culture that are extremely long-lived, right? So it's hard to predict. I would say Oshikatsu is here to stay, or rather, let's say, for the maybe next 10, 20 years, because you can understand it. So if you think of it as a development of more traditional forms of fandom, you can sort of see how it is becoming more targeted, more individualized, and of course, social media have massively enabled that. So you can now become a Twidoru, so a Twitter idol, without the backing of a talent agency, for example. You can build your own following, your own fandom online. You can use financial platforms to monetize that. You can do it traditionally through YouTube, but you can also produce your own, merchandise and then sell that online. So these things have become much more easier to do. And so I think what we'll see in the next 5 to 10 years is an explosion of micro idols, people who are more targeted or targeting what they do to more specific audiences, and that they're trying to make a living out of that, having maybe, a few hundred or a few thousand followers. So away from these huge, massive juggernauts like, Taylor Swift fandom, or in Japan, the Alfie.
Dr. Fabio Gygi, thank you so much for your time. But before we go, I would like to ask you, do you have 3 books or 4 books that you recommend for our listeners?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So it's interesting because Oshikatsu is a relatively recent phenomenon. There are no books yet. There's lots of articles written, but of course there are books about Japanese idol culture. And I think the most sort of theoretically satisfying one is the classic by Hiroshi Aoyagi called Islands of 8 Million Smiles, Idol Performance and Symbolic Production in Contemporary Japan, which is an analysis of the idol system So that will give you a very good insight how it works, how the idols are perceived and how they perceive themselves, and how images are packaged and created. That's for 2005, so that sort of more addresses the traditional fandom. There's also the work of Patrick Galbraith, Idols and Celebrity in Japanese Media Culture. That's an edited volume, very useful because there's many different aspects of Japanese idol culture that are discussed in that. There's also the slightly older edited volume by William Kelly, Fanning the Flames, Fans and Consumer Culture in Contemporary Japan, which is also a very interesting starting point. It's an edited volume, so you have many different, you have fandom of sports, you have rock bands, for example, but you also have idols and actors, so sort of different kind of aspects brought together. And finally, there is Usami Rin's Idol Burling, Oshimoyu, that won the 2020, I think it was, Akutagawa Prize, and was translated by Asa Yoneda. So you can read that as a fictionalized account of a relationship between a fan and her Oshi.
Fabio Gygi, thank you so much. And for our listeners, if you have any questions or comments or feedback, please leave it below. And again, Fabio, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.